Hey guys! Today we're finally getting back into the Volvo B230 build. If you recall, we're building up this 16 valve red block to put into my 68 142. It's actually been so long that I had to watch the last video to see exactly where we left off. Okay, I'm all caught up. The bottom end is assembled, but we weren't confident about the piston deck height measurement. I think we measured the piston with a feeler gauge at about 17 thousandths per out of the block. That was going to be pretty tight with a stock head gasket, so I think we should probably measure it properly to see what we're really dealing with. This bridge allows us to use a basic dial indicator to compare the deck of the block to the top of the piston. Once it's zeroed out, we have a good reference from which to measure the piston at top dead center. In a perfect world, the piston would be exactly flush with the top of the block, or maybe a few thousandths out of the hole. "24 thousandths. That's even worse than I thought. A stock head gasket has a compressed thickness of around 40 thousandths, which would leave us with less than 20 thousandths clearance from the crown of the piston to the quench pad on the head. Ideally, that clearance should be around 40 thousandths. Luckily, I happen to have an extra head gasket, so we'll just double them up. Just kidding. I actually ordered a .066 Cometic MLS gasket, which gets us back into that ideal clearance range. This is a multi-layer steel gasket and should provide a better seal than the OEM composite gasket. I was hoping to avoid using one of these because I actually like the idea of the OEM gasket acting as a bit of a fuse in case I make some rookie tuning mistakes. I'd rather blow a head gasket than bend a rod or crack another block or something like that. But OEM is no longer an option for us, so here we are. With the gasket on the block, we can go pick up the head at the machine shop. I had to drive all the way up to Portland for this because I couldn't find a closer shop that had ever even heard of a Volvo B234. Plus, I'm just a sucker for a good hand-painted sign. These guys stripped the head down, cleaned it, lapped the valves, helicoiled a bunch of bolt holes, replaced the valve stem seals, and skimmed it a bit. I had them leave the brand new Mustang valve springs that were already in there from the previous owner. In addition to changing the head gasket plan, we're also going to ditch the ARP studs in favor of some new OEM head bolts. I think at our power levels, bolts will be fine, and we won't have to disassemble everything to retorque them after a break-in period, like we would have with the studs. I don't know, maybe there's something about the MLS gasket and OEM bolts that won't work well together. But if that's the case, I guess we can just go back to the studs. I'll keep them around just in case. To torque this lower section of the head onto the block, we're using the specs for the B234 engine. Volvo wants us to torque the bolts in 3 stages. First to 15 foot-pounds, then to 30 foot-pounds, and then 115 degrees past that. With the lower section torque, we can go prep the upper part of the head. This cam carrier is a pretty cool piece of aluminum. It has the bores for the lifters and the cams, plus it has a bunch of little oil passages that let oil flow through the 2 pieces. Volvo lore states that the B230 head was designed by Porsche, but I've also heard it was designed by Cosworth. I wasn't there, so I don't know. But either way, I think a red block ceases to be a tractor engine once you slap one of these heads on it. Since we need to seal these two pieces together and not clog any oil passages, we're going to use the official Volvo anaerobic sealer. Loctite makes a product that also works, but we got the real stuff. It only hardens in the absence of oxygen, so chunks of it can't fall off and get stuck like RTV would. Definitely do not use RTV to seal this head. A roller like this seems to be the best way to spread the sealer out. It has a really fine nap and leaves a pretty thin uniform layer, which I have to assume is what we want here. After some assembly lube in the cam journals and some oil in the lifter bores, we can drop these new lifters in. These weren't super expensive, and it seemed like a good idea to throw fresh ones in. Plus, when I took the old ones out, I labeled them with Sharpie, but it all rubbed off, and I have no idea which lifter went into which bore, and you need to know that when you put them back together. So these fresh ones don't care, and they're going in. These are just stock cams for now. I'd like to get some higher revving cams in here because I think some of the other stuff we're using could be good for a higher RPM power band. But we'll get it running first and see how it goes with the stock ones. At this point, the cams are compressing the valve springs, so we're tightening the caps in stages to avoid snapping a cam. The final cam cap torque of 15 foot-pounds holds the cams in and holds the entire cam carrier to the lower part of the head. This all seems like a hassle, but I'm sure there were some geometry constraints that Ferdinand Porsche himself was working around as he personally drafted this design. All sealed up. Hopefully it doesn't leak. Speaking of leaks, we need to plug the hole left by the cam-driven distributor that we won't be using. Apparently this plug likes to pop out and spill a bunch of oil onto the bell housing, so YoshiFab makes this retainer. There is a special seal press that you can get for these front cam seals, and basically all the other seals on any engine. But I found that just using an old seal to push the new one in usually works pretty well. And like we did with the intermediate shaft in the last Volvo video, we'll replace these roll pins with solid steel ones from IPD. It looks like the sun came out, and it would be insane not to open up that big old door for some natural light. We're just going to toss this valve cover on without a gasket for now. I may bring it to get powder coated later, so there's no sense in wasting a gasket. At least it'll stop dust from falling into the engine. The plan right now is to get all the cooling system parts on the engine, but I got sidetracked and put on the timing gears first. These are adjustable gears from STS Machining here in Oregon. The adjustability of the gears should let me move the stock cam power band around a bit, plus they look way cooler than stock gears. We'll torque these once the belt is on, and as a reminder, some red tape. Okay, cooling system stuff. This is just an OEM Volvo 87-degree thermostat. With the housing bolted on, it seems like there's a clearance issue with the intake manifold. Hopefully a different bolt will fix that, but we'll deal with that later. And this is a HEPU water pump. It has a cast impeller instead of plastic or stamped steel. It's generally thought of as one of the better water pump options for a B230. I've always had good luck with this non-hardening Permatex gasket compound on paper gaskets, so that's what we're doing here. Doing the pump on a red block is kind of annoying because you need to pry the pump upward to compress the seal against the head. It's not difficult, it's just an extra thing to deal with. A pry bar on the front main seal housing works pretty well for that. I think I mentioned core plug retention in the last video. I had an older style plug on my B230 fall out while driving, and that was a huge pain in the ass. To fully prevent that, I'm installing these retainers from Zelig's garage. You could definitely just make some of these out of some 1/8 inch aluminum, but these look great and we'll have plenty of cutting to do later in the project. Plus, when the aftermarket for a given platform is so small like it is for Volvo red blocks, the people selling stuff really deserve the support. This shot's pretty funny to me because I feel like we're witnessing the moment that the Saab realized they'll never receive that level of attention. Sorry, buddy. On a B230, there's a steel tube that runs from the pump to the heater valve behind the engine. They're usually super rusty and they're made of mild steel, so we've got this stainless one from STS Machining. The heater valve and heater hose routing on a 142 with a 16 valve head is a whole other issue, but we'll figure that out later. Okay, I've been putting this off for a while because eventually I want to make a new pan with really good baffling and a solid steel flange. But I think we need the engine in the car to accurately make one, and it's honestly just not that important right now. So the B20 pan from the last engine is going back on. Here we're cutting off the excess paper gasket ends from the front and rear main seal housings. We'll use some more non-hardening gasket maker in these spots. Aside from the gasket maker in the corners, this gasket is going on dry. I've done oil pan gaskets with sealant and without, and they seem to weep slightly no matter what. And a dry gasket is easier to change, so we'll do that. Over-tightening the bolts on a stamped steel pan is a really good way to have a leak, so we're torquing these to a mere 8 foot-pounds with blue Loctite on the threads. If I ever get around to making that pan I was talking about, I'll start with a thick laser cut steel flange, which should seal really well and be less sensitive to the torque spec. And with the pan finally on, we can dump 4 quarts of cheap 1040 oil in here to test the oil system. This is the oil pump drive shaft, which is driven by a gear on the auxiliary shaft. Spinning that with a drill primes the system, and it looks like oil is getting all the way up to the cams, so we should be good. Off camera I installed this Yoshi-Fab 16-valve conversion belt tensioner. It bolts into some holes on the head and has an idler and a tensioner from some kind of Volkswagen, I think. Another Yoshi-Fab product that you kind of need to make this all work is this billet crank gear. It's wider than the 8-valve one and uses a Woodruff key to slot into the crank and crank pulley. Obviously, the crank pulley needs to have the same corresponding keyway milled into it. I bought this one ready to go from KL Racing. Then we can throw a new crank bolt in it and torque it to 45 foot-pounds, and then an additional 60 degrees. Also, I found that bolting a piece of 3/16 flat stock onto the crank works really well to hold it while it's on an engine stand. With this crank gear, you need to make your own top dead center mark on the belt guide, which I've done here. That has to line up with the mark on the mainsail housing when the engine is at top dead center. The cam gears are lined up to their marks on the valve cover. The auxiliary shaft is lined up to roughly 3 o'clock because I don't currently have a lower timing cover on, which normally has the auxiliary timing mark. It's not really critical though, since we're going to run a cam angle sensor off that shaft and we will be able to adjust its value in the ECU software. And with everything lined up, we can put the belt on. I'm sure there's a real slick way to do this, but I found that simply struggling with it for several minutes also works. We'll use some circlip pliers to rotate the tensioner and tighten the belt until it can be twisted about 90 degrees on its longest span. And all the marks are staying lined up after rotating the engine a few times, so I'm happy with that. To fit a 16-valve B230 into a 142, you pretty much have to make your own manifolds. Or at least you did 6 years ago when I started this. There are a couple cast turbo manifolds now, but I don't know if they'd fit in a 140 anyway. I made these several years ago, and now we have to straighten out the flanges, which warped during welding. I think the best tool for this job would be a mill, but we don't have one. This cheap sander is just long enough for a 4-cylinder flange, and it does a decent job. Takes forever though. So obviously this is the intake manifold. It represents my third attempt at making one. With each attempt I got rid of things that I thought were good in favor of things that I thought I could actually make. Look at this scrapped attempt for example. I started with a 1/2 inch thick aluminum plate and used a wood router radius bit to make these cool bell mouths inside the plenum. The plan was to then bolt this to a cast carb manifold, then weld injector bungs on it. But I ran out of skill and blew through the runners and gave up on that design entirely. I feel like I should revisit that if I ever get any better at aluminum welding. What I could pull off is this very simple box which is welded to an OEM flange and runners. This way the injector bungs are already cast in and I just had to weld up a box for a plenum. It's not fancy and probably won't flow really well, but it is done. Well, almost done. I've decided to use a Bosch electronic throttle body, so at some point I'll need to cut the flange off and weld on a slightly different one. The fuel rail is a billet option from Yoshi Fab, again, and it has 60-pound injectors in it currently. I may need more fuel than that, but we'll see. That's the thing about taking such a long break on a project. The goals have changed a bit, but I still have a lot of parts I bought 5 years ago. This turbo manifold is also the best I could do at the time. It's stainless except for the flange, which is mild steel. Good thing too, because it warped a bunch when welding, and mild steel is softer and easier to flatten out in the sander. We were able to get it totally flat except for this one small spot in the corner, but that should be sealed up by the gasket. So a couple things about this manifold. The most obvious is that it has 2 wastegate holes. That's because it's a twin scroll manifold and separates the exhaust into 2 pairs of cylinders. This needs a special turbine housing on the turbo and either 2 wastegates or a clever way to keep the exhaust separated with just 1 wastegate. I'm not that clever, so I just bought a cast stainless collector with the wastegate ports on either side. You may be thinking, hey, that manifold has terrible wastegate priority. Wastegate priority being a more direct flow of exhaust toward the wastegate than the turbo. And to that I say you're right, but I'm hoping that simply having 2 38mm wastegates is enough to make up for the poor design. We're going for quantity, not quality here. Speaking of poor design, a proper twin scroll manifold should have equal length runners. The whole point of it is to separate the exhaust pulses and deliver them to the turbo in a smooth pattern, which is based on the firing order of the engine. I wasn't quite able to do that, just because I lack the fabrication skills, so we won't be seeing the full benefit of the twin scroll thing. Also, while I'm bashing the work I did 5 years ago, I should mention that this was not back purged when I welded it. It's made out of .125 wall cast elbows, and with my old TIG welder I wasn't getting full penetration. So at least there's no oxidation or sugaring on the inside, but I am well aware that not purging it was the wrong thing to do. It may crack after its first heat cycle, who knows. But if it does, we'll just make something better. I don't know if we need to be bolting all this stuff to the engine right now, but we've got some momentum and that's exactly what this project needs. This is the rest of the stuff I built. We've got a bunch of wastegate exhaust tubing, 2 tile wastegates, some bracing, a wacky 4-inch downpipe, and of course the turbo itself. It's a Borg Warner S252 SXE with a 1.0 AR divided T4 turbine housing. I have no idea why they did this, but although the bolt pattern is T4 sized, the openings on the housing are T3 sized. So we'll have to hog out a bunch of cast iron with the die grinder. I think there are probably better turbo options for a 400-ish horsepower 4-cylinder, but I do have reasons for using this one. First off, it's oil-cooled only and has no coolant lines to deal with. Running coolant to a turbo is not a big deal, but it is an added thing to figure out, and there's already a lot going on in this engine bay. The second reason is price. I think I paid about $800 for this back in 2019. Back then, Borg Warner claimed that it had similar compressor wheel geometry to their high-end EFR turbos, which are really good, just in a simpler journal-bearing center housing. So yeah, I think it's just a solid, cheap turbo that flows 55 pounds a minute, and it should get us pretty close to our completely arbitrary goal of 400 horsepower. Close, but maybe not quite there. In hindsight, the S257 would have been a good choice also, but we already have this 252, so we should at least try it out. With this manifold design, you can see how we're hanging a big old chunk of iron pretty far off the side of the head. A real engineer would probably say something about a long moment arm, but the only moment I care about is this whole contraption ripping the threads out of the head the moment the engine starts moving around. So this is what I came up with. The main brace is triangulated between two M6 valve cover bolts and a larger M8 bolt on the head. From there we have this adjustable turnbuckle thing that attaches to the main turbo bolts. We'll just adjust this so it takes a tiny bit of weight at rest, and hopefully that at least helps the situation. Maybe you're noticing a flaw in my logic here, and if so, I'd love to hear about it. I think the best way to brace this turbo would be from the engine block up to the bottom of the turbo, but there's a lot going on down there, and I haven't been able to find room for more bracing. But still, I'm keen to hear your thoughts. The wastegate's just attached to the collector with their little clamps. One is black because it's brand new, and the other one is kind of purple because that's the one I used on my last engine and it faded a bit. This downpipe here is an absolute monstrosity. The V-band on the turbine housing has a 4-inch diameter, so I thought it would be cool to make a 4-inch downpipe. Completely overkill. I hate the sound of a wastegate dumping into open air, especially on a 4-cylinder, so we'll be sending all that noise back into the exhaust. It's been a while, but I remember this stuff being really fun to build. Each tube has a flex bellows section to allow for some movement, and it all fits up pretty nicely. So here's the whole system from underneath. It's pretty busy, like I said earlier, and it still needs oil feed and drain lines to the turbo. The welding and fabrication aren't going to win any awards, but I'd like to remind the audience that I'm a graphic designer 5 days a week. I'm pretty good at making the logo bigger, but with all this other stuff, I'm just trying to keep learning new things. On the topic of learning, I'm about to be in way over my head with the rest of this car. First of all, I have some developments on the transmission plan. I had this Tremec T5 5-speed in the car before, but I absolutely hated it. It shifts well, but it has a weirdly high 5th gear ratio and sounds like a bucket of bolts despite being brand new and having a huge slip yoke damper on it. These transmissions just don't like the vibrations specific to a 4-cylinder, at least not a red block. So I've gone and picked up a fairly low mileage ZF 8HP45. I never once thought this car would get an automatic transmission, but I've been doing my research and have fully embraced the idea. This transmission can be shifted manually, and with the right TCU control, shifts super quick. If you're unfamiliar with the 8HP, you should do some internet searching. It's a pretty awesome piece of technology, and one that I'm pretty excited to put into a 58-year-old car. It's going to take a lot of cutting to get this thing into the transmission tunnel. It's quite a bit bigger than the old T5. I'm sure at some point during that cutting, I'll probably regret my decision. But in the end, I think it'll be pretty badass to see this Volvo ripping through 8 gears with an electric sequential shifter. The other big thing is that we've settled on a max ECU race for both engine and transmission control. Going with the race gets us knock protection, and other cool stuff like e-throttle compatibility, built-in wideband, and map sensors. Once we get the engine and transmission in the car, just wiring up and learning how to use an aftermarket ECU could be a whole YouTube series on its own. I've never done anything like that, so the learning curve will be steep and potentially entertaining. Is anyone else doing anything similar? Any feedback at all is welcome here. I'm not sure if you can tell, but I'm well out of my depth. Anyway, thanks for watching.